A child with one developmental disorder has a 50% chance of having another one. That is definitely true for children with LD, where the co-occurrence with ADHD is reported to be 40 to 50%. And that's why it's very important to assess both learning disabilities and ADHD if one condition has been identified. To give you a good example, I, in my past clinical practice, assessed a number of children whose diagnosis with ADHD, and in fact, many of them were in programs for behavior disorders. When I identified the learning disability that was co-occurring with ADHD and that was properly served, these kids very often did not need the services for behavior disorders. So let's talk about the primary facts about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is a chronic health condition. That's very important to emphasize because many people look at it as a behavioral issue. It's a chronic health condition that affects millions of children, and it very often persists into adulthood where the outcomes are poor if they have not been appropriately diagnosed and treated. Early treatment equals by far the best outcome, and I'll return to these points in just a little while. It's also true that more boys are identified with ADHD than girls, and that may very well be because boys tend to have more of the external hyperactive symptoms, whereas girls may have more of the distractibility, difficulty with attention, and internalized characteristics. So what are the symptoms of ADHD? As you're looking at these, you can see why so many of them interact with failure in school. These kids very often will have difficulty with paying attention, with following directions, organizing their tasks and their belongings. Their stuff may be all over the place. They may have trouble waiting their turn and staying in their seat. Frequently, they would daydream, fidget or squirm. Very often they'll lose their needed items, books, pencils, backpacks, their homework. They fail to finish homework, their chores or other tasks, and they very often interrupt or intrude on others' conversations or games. The essential feature of attention deficit disorder is an inability to direct and sustain and appropriately use attention. Processing deficits of attention deficit disorder that interact with learning disabilities very often are linguistic. Like kids with learning disabilities, they may have significant differences with word retrieval or auditory memory. They almost universally, in my experience, actually 100% of them have visual motor deficits, so printing and writing is extraordinarily difficult for them, and they will usually avoid it at all costs. They also have a big difficulty with tracking, with ocular motor efficiency while they're reading. And sometimes in the past, we have mixed that up with specific reading disability. They will have trouble with perception of space, where their body is in space. I had one young child with ADHD, a very large second grader, who, when the bell rang at recess, came charging up at the back of the recess line and inadvertently bumped into the kid in front of him, and it became a domino effect where virtually all the kids splattered to the ground. They will also have trouble with time misperceptions, will have more difficulty than usual estimating how long something will take or being on time. Written language is an exceptional area of difficulty for them. Organization of their thoughts for writing and legibility. But what are the outcomes for untreated ADHD? We really need to look at this as a chronic health impairment that needs to be addressed early on. This study looked at adults who had not been treated. 60% of them continued to have symptoms. 75% of them reported depression or low self-esteem, and a high number had juvenile or adult convictions. Of the untreated ADHD people, alcoholism was found in 27%, and unemployment or underemployment, 75% reported interpersonal problems. So this is not just a fidgety episode in a kid. This is something that really needs to be treated, seriously treated. What is the best treatment for ADHD? Our experts across the years have indicated that it needs to be multimodal. Medication is very, very often effective for children, and although many parents are leery to use the medications associated with treatment of ADHD, there are two things to think about. One is that medications such as Ritalin have been more investigated than any other medical treatment of childhood across 40 years or more at this point, and have been found to be safe. The other is, as one of my friends who's a developmental psychiatrist said, you need to think about the side effects of not giving medication. And in the slide previous to this, I showed you some of the side effects of growing up without appropriate treatment of ADHD. But medication is not the whole answer. Kids also need some help with behavioral, with organizing their things, with getting their homework done. Very often it's a work completion contract that helps them to get on track. And they need success in school. And here's where the assessment of their academic struggles needs to take place. It is not sufficient to just assume that their failure in school is due to the ADHD, especially since you can assume that 50% of them will also have a learning disability that needs to be addressed. It's also very important to understand that ADHD and LD often co-occurs with gifts and talents, and this is not usually recognized in children with ADHD, or very often in children with learning disabilities also. But if you see this slide on the positive characteristics of ADHD, you can see how many of them coexist with the same characteristics of kids who have special gifts and talents. These kids are insensitive, they're intuitive, they're inquisitive. They have boundless energy when interest is caught. They're enthusiastic, and they are divergent thinkers. They think of solutions that nobody else has thought of, very often after they've gotten themselves into a difficult situation. I'll tell a story about my son. As an adult, he was in New York with one of his customers from Peru a couple weeks before Christmas. And the day before Christmas, he was to fly to Minnesota, to Minneapolis, with his customer and meet his younger brother who had a car rental and come down to southern Minnesota. Well, do you think my son, knowing this 2 weeks before, had ordered tickets for himself and his client? No. He was going to do that the day before Christmas, but he found he had lost his American Express card, and his visa was maxed. Not because he didn't have money in the bank, but because he hadn't paid. By the time he got his American Express back and was able to catch a flight, he came in about midnight of Christmas Eve. And do you know how many cars you can find for rent in Minneapolis at that time of night? Nada. Not one. Now, most people would think to go to a motel and try again the next day, but he convinced a virtually non-English speaking cab driver to drive him all the way to southern Minnesota for really much less than 2 motel rooms would have cost him for the night. As someone said to me, I never would have thought of that. And yes, people with ADHD do think of things like that, but those of us who don't have it usually don't get ourselves in the situation where we have to do the divergent thinking. So before we finish this very brief introduction to ADHD, I'd like to give you an example of what it feels like to have ADHD when you have a school assignment. I picked this particular image because my son used to tell me that he felt like he had 57 different monkeys on his back all the time, trying to figure out what to do when during the day. And this one kind of reminded me of trying to wear many different hats at the same time and juggling them. The selection on the right is what we call fake Latin, and you are to read this and just answer the 3 questions that I give you on the left as guides. So please pause the presentation at this point and take the time to read and answer the questions. As you were trying to complete this assignment, did you often feel like you lost attention, that you had to go back and try to find where you were in the reading, that you couldn't keep all of the information in mind? Well, then you've had just a little bit of an example of what it's like to have an attention deficit disorder with all of the reading requirements of school. So keep in mind, more than anything else, that early diagnosis and treatment of ADHD equals the best outcome. For more information about this topic, I refer you first to the Mayo Clinic article that has to do with the basics, the symptoms, and the treatment of ADHD. The second reference is to a wonderful PDF out of Scotland that talks a great deal about the comorbidity of ADHD, learning disabilities, gifts and talents, and the other things.